What is the relationship between civil liberty and economic liberty? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show, as y'all know, that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for libertarianism, for the free society. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Hope you've been doing well, and I'm glad to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, good to see you again, and good to have you all back with us. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 32 years of principled, uncompromising perspectives on liberty, including conferences, videos, articles, blogs, and so forth. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we have strived for, I think, 20 years now to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet on a daily basis. We've got a great monthly journal called Future of Freedom. We've got the Libertarian Angle here. We've got conferences. And, well, Richard, we're in the midst of a great conference right now, our Civil Liberties Conference. You gave a great talk on civil liberties and economic liberty. We're now moving into I think it's week 8 now, and we'll have, we had 2 fantastic talks last night by Radley Balco, who's one of those libertarians who has found success in the mainstream media and works for the Washington Post, does absolutely excellent work on police abuses and Supreme Court cases and death penalty cases, and the guy's just fantastic, a great asset for the libertarian movement. And then he was followed by Jonathan Turley, who just gave an absolutely excellent talk on the First Amendment, and interestingly enough, spent a considerable amount of time talking about the left's attack on freedom of speech. Traditionally, leftists have been pretty good on civil liberties, but now they're just disasters. Well, you gave this excellent talk that, the left would never give that type of talk. You incorporated economic liberties, which is sort of a libertarian conservative notion, with civil liberties, which is traditionally, up to recently, had been a leftist notion. And so I thought, we ought to discuss that more fully. I think you brought up a lot of good angles, but the overall perspective that you brought up is something that I think needs to be emphasized, and people need to be exposed to it, both on the left and the right, and especially here within the libertarian movement. So why don't you give us a little synopsis of what your talk was about, and then we'll just take it from there.
Well, in gist, what I attempted to do was to remind people and explain to people that liberty is a seamless, indivisible tapestry, whether it be personal freedom, civil liberties, economic freedom. They're all bound together because they're dependent upon the same essential philosophic, social, economic, and political principles and institutions. Often you'll hear people on the left, as you were just suggesting, is that while they want government control, intervention, regulation over the private sector, believing that free markets, when left alone, result in undesirable outcomes. And they will also advocate forms of government redistribution, believing that the relative income shares that the market results in is somehow socially unjust or unfair or unacceptable. But they say that, well, they're going to control the market, regulate the market, command the market, centrally plan, the more socialists of them will say. They believe that that can be done with no loss of civil liberties. We can still have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of being secure in one's person and papers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we usually think of in the United States as our core fundamental 10th Amendment Bill of Rights to the Constitution. But as I attempted to bring out in my comments the other week as part of the online conference on civil liberties, In fact, the preservation of these freedoms that I just enumerated are at the end of the day inseparable from and cannot be preserved without the recognition of private property and free markets. And I explained by using some historical examples. The Soviet Union had a variety of constitutions written during the 75 years of Marxist communist rule of the country, of Russia and the other Soviet republics. But particularly, I brought out that in the mid-1930s, I believe it was 1936, 1937, Stalin had a new constitution promulgated and rubber stamped by the phony baloney, their version of parliament. And if you read that constitution, it's almost in certain past sections of it, like reading the Bill of Rights. Every Soviet citizen was assured freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of association, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, along with, of course, the socialist freedoms and guarantees. A government guaranteed job, government health care, government pension, government this, government that, government housing, and so on and so on. A fair wage. And those who either were socialists or communists, or even those sympathetic to these progressive policies, would say, well, you see, there's the Soviet Union. All of your concerns about core civil liberties are preserved, but people have all these other social freedoms guaranteed and given to them by the government. You see, we don't need to protect private property and free markets to have the civil liberties that truly all of us agree upon. But the fact is that was not the case. Anyone who knew or followed the news and reports about the Soviet Union at that time and till its end realized that there were no such actual civil liberties that we took for granted and have continued to take for granted in the United States. And why? And again, as I try to explain in my comments, Jacob, that without private property and the freedom of exchange and competition, no such securities and guarantees can be given to people. How so? Well, in the Soviet Union, since the government was the owner and therefore the controller and central planner of all production and the means of production through which production was undertaken, unless the government chose to allocate resources, raw materials, and land to facilitate people to undertake the actions without which civil expressions are not possible, they were denied. The example I gave was religion. Yes, there was freedom of religion in the Soviet Constitution, but what if the Soviet government did not choose to allocate some portion of the government nationalized and controlled land for the location of building a church? What if the Soviet government, under the central plan, did not direct and assign a construction company to build a place of worship, a church? What if the Soviet government and its central planning agency did not include in its 5-year plan instructions and commands to a government-owned publishing house to print up the Bibles and the hymnals? How then could the people who shared a particular faith and wished to express it socially as a congregation succeed and have the ability to do so, when if the state chose not to allocate the resources without which it could not be done, that freedom de facto in reality was denied? The same thing was freedom of association and freedom from government oppression of one's liberties. The fact is, in the Soviet Union, there was only one game in town, and that was the government. So what if you got into bad relations with your employer at the state enterprise where you had your work, or you were viewed as politically incorrect or somehow viewed as an opponent of the system, whether true or not, and you were let go, you were fired? Where do you find other means of employment? I tried to explain. The fact is, every other place of work is also a government agency, a government department, a government business, a government factory, a government industry. So you cannot escape from the state as the ability to oppress you, discriminate against you, deny you employment, restrict you to a low-paying job from which no escape would be possible, because any attempt to laterally move to another enterprise is another state enterprise, and the word would be out through the government agencies that you were to be given no status different than you had before, if you had any status at all. Or you could be just arrested and sent to do mandatory work in a slave labor camp in Siberia. Now, again, the other theme, Jacob, that I emphasized as sort of a contrast to this was one that Milton Friedman, the well-known free market University of Chicago economist, would often bring out. And that was the case of the blacklist, the Hollywood blacklists of the early 1950s. There was a strong anti-communist hysteria in the late 1940s, early 1950s, out of the result of the Second World War, Stalin's grabbing of the Eastern European countries behind what became known as the Iron Curtain, Mao's conquest with his communist armies of mainland China. Then in 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War, where the United States was then drawn into a conflict with both communist North Korea, and then Mao sent the Chinese communist armies in. And then on top of that were all these unearthings of the fact that there were either communist spies and agents or sympathetic fellow travelers who passed on U.S. government secrets to the Soviet Union. So there was these fears that spies and agents were penetrating the government and other outlets such as Hollywood. And there was a blacklisting of many of the lead screenwriters. And this became a case celeb, as the phrase is used, among progressives and American liberals and the left in general, an example of persecution of people merely because of their ideas and the fact that they held values and believed in political alternatives to the existing American system, that they were being denied their civil liberties and discriminated against and pushed out of employment by a bullying government. Now, what happened to these people? Were they arrested? Were they tortured? Were they sent to a labor camp? Were they simply executed? No. Were they able to find other means of employment and ways of earning a living? Yes. Was it their first choice? Surely if you're a screenwriter in Hollywood, you may be both doing something that you like to do, plus probably making a quite decent salary. Some of them were very well-known and well-paid screenwriters. But they were not denied employment or shunted into a position of being a janitor in another government agency, because there were no government enterprises and corporations and mom and pop stores. No, there were all these alternative private sector opportunities outside of, independent of, and not directly or indirectly under really bullying or influence of the government to no, don't hire him, don't give him a well-paying job. So all of these people found second best employments. Should they have been persecuted in this way? And should Hollywood movie studios have been pressured in that manner by the US government? A classical liberal, an advocate of individual freedom, most likely would have said no, that was not the duty and responsibility of the government. And certainly that this was a violation of the powers of the government to abuse people. But nonetheless, given that the government did that, these people had an alternative parallel private sector of private enterprise and private property and free association and contracting for work conditions and wages and types of work to be done that gave them the alternatives to continue to live and believe in their ideas and express them if they wanted to, while earning a living without suffering the heavy hand of government in every facet of their lives. And private enterprise and private property and economic freedom allowed that. That is the essential importance of this. We see this today, where the government is trying to bully and pressure people. What do they do? What has Joe Biden been doing? Of course, people have the freedom to decide whether to get a vaccination against COVID or not. Who's the government to like bully you and drag you in to a clinic and give you an injection in your arm without your permission? Of course, we're not violating your freedom. Oh, but the medical clinics and the nursing homes and the other places of business that the government considers essential, important, or necessary to target, well, you can keep employing those people if they've not been vaccinated, but any government subsidies, any government contracts, any government flows of money that come your way will be cut off. So we're not saying that your employees have to be vaccinated or for you to let them go either furloughed or fired. It's your free choice. You're a private company. You just will be denied all of the government money. Now, this of course raises the additional issue: should the government be involved in the subsidizing and funding and paying for these services, without which these strings could not be pulled in the first place? But notice, they can use this game. Well, it's a private enterprise. People are free to choose, but the government can use its levers of the purse strings to pressure people into either doing something that their conscience is telling them they don't need to do or don't want to do, or medically may be dubious to do, or fired. And that is the power of the government when it violates, interferes with, intrudes into private enterprise, freedom of exchange, the property rights of people, and the decisions that individuals wish to make between themselves and others, both inside and outside of the workplace, that the government may not like, but people should have the latitude and liberty to choose to do, as long as they don't in any way, in the traditional sense, harm another.
Yeah, excellent points all the way along. In fact, you reminded me of a trip that I took to Cuba many years ago. I had gotten permission from the Treasury Department, a license. I mean, imagine Americans having to go get permission to travel to a particular country. I mean, it just goes to show you what's happened to America. Freedom of travel is a fundamental God-given right, and we got to go get permission. And then I'd gotten permission from the Cuban authority too, both governments giving permission, which kind of says a lot. But I encountered some free enterprise people there in Cuba, believe it or not. There was one group that was very libertarian. And I went to one of their meetings, and one of them invited me up to his apartment or his house. And in his library, there were books by Mises and Friedman and Hayek. And it was fascinating. And I said, how do you get away with this? And he says, well, as long as you couch everything in terms of reforming the revolution or revising the revolution or improving the revolution, you're okay. You just can't question the revolution itself. Well, I said, well, tell me about what happens if they're going to punish you. That let's say they get mad at you. You've got one employer, which I found absolutely fascinating, because I'd read the principles of socialism, one employer, but I'd never seen it in action. And here it was. Everybody works for the state. Or like 99% of people work for the state. And I said, what happens if they get mad at you? Do they fire you and then just starve you to death? And he says, no, that they're really not that brutal. They would never starve a person to death with that power. He says, but what they do, especially with younger people, if younger people start to protest or rebel against some of the stuff going on, they just transfer you. So they transfer you from Havana over to the other side of the island, and and he says they leave your girlfriend over on this side in Havana, so that you're separated by this long distance now. And he says that's the leverage they have over you to make sure that you behave within the contours of their rules and regulations. Now, someone, of course, might say, oh, well, here, Jacob and Richard, here in the United States, there's private property, and so those problems don't really exist, but they really do in forms of regulation and controls. The foundation really of freedom of speech is private property, Richard. I mean, that was one of the principles you brought out in your talk. One of the greatest examples of freedom of speech from the left standpoint is that old saying by Oliver Wendell Holmes that he used in one of his judicial opinions. He says, no one has the right to cry fire in a crowded theater. And that's always been built up as a freedom of speech issue. Well, that's just nonsense. That if a theater owner, and movie theaters are privately owned, if a movie theater says anybody in my theater can cry fire in a crowded theater, then that's the way it is. That it's not a free speech issue, it's a private property issue. The owner of the private property determines how that property is going to be used. Now, where the regulation comes in and the control is that's the hammer they have to constrain people's freedom of speech. We've got the Internal Revenue Service. Everybody is terrified when they get a letter from the IRS. Oh my gosh, this could be an audit. Well, that is going to constrain what you're going to be saying and talking about if you're a big executive. Now, people like you and me, they don't care. But you take a big executive, for one of the big corporations, how often do you see them criticizing U.S. foreign policy, for example, criticizing the CIA or the forever wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, wherever? You don't ever see that. When do you see bank presidents taking public stands at a fundamental level against the government? Never, because they know that when a team of bank examiners comes into that office, into that bank executives quiver and quake. I mean, every bank president gets nervous as heck. Why? Because they have the power to write them up and effectively shut them down. And you've got those types of regulations and controls throughout American society. Or as you point out, they have the largesse they promise too. So if somebody's dependent on the largesse, let's take a university, for example. There's a lot of universities get federal largesse. What are the chances that they're going to take a big public stance against the drug war, the government's drug war, when the government could simply say, well, we're going to cut off your grant this year? I mean, that's the type of thing that suppresses people. It constrains people. And that's where freedom of speech is really, really limited in America. It's because of the economic controls. Now, what do we libertarians say? Stop the control. Stop the power to regulate. We call for a separation of economy and the state. And that if government no longer has the power to control or regulate your economic activity, now you're free to say anything you want. You don't have to worry about the government retaliating against you with a IRS audit because there's no income tax in IRS. There's no economic regulations that they come after you with. They can't cut off your largesse as you suggested, because they don't have the power to give largesse. You eliminate the controls, the regulations, the welfare statism, the income tax. And now we're talking about a genuinely free society, not just economically speaking, but freedom of speech speaking.
So I think an example of this is the seeming unanimity of, quote, the experts about the existence, the danger, and the supposed remedy to solve global warming. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a climatology expert. But it is clear to me that science is never a closed book. All statements about the physical world may be sometimes called laws, like the laws of gravity, but they're basically tentative conjectures about supposed causal and correlated relationships among physical elements. Now, why is there so much uniformity of opinion? It seems to be that A, global warming is occurring, B, it's of this magnitude with this likelihood of further development, and the need for these types of government centralized national or international forms of planning, control, command, and prohibition. How many of these scientists who share that mainstream and majoritarian view are at institutions of higher learning or at other scientific institutions dependent heavily, sometimes solely, on government money? The National Science Foundation gives out huge, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollar grants to either an individual or certainly scientific research groups. Does it not enter people's minds when they submit an application for a sizable, financially sizable research grant? What is likely to fly? What would most likely be denied? To go against the ideological mainstream of the views on global warming, or one that sort of reinforces it or gives it an additional twist to show that the mainstream majoritarian view is correct? That is the danger of this. Now, even critics of the global warming profession argue that the climate is changing and that the temperatures seem to be moderately rising. But how much is it due to the fact that the world itself just goes through these cycles? Planet Earth has had heating periods, cooling periods, long before the Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century. I know it's shocking, but there was a planet before 300 years ago. Amazing. They only need to talk to a geologist. So how much is due to that, just the natural changes of the globe itself that's been going on since the beginning of this ball gravitating around the sun? And how much is due to things that human beings have been doing with influencing the particles in the environment through fossil fuel usage? That's an issue that is not closed. And if you talk to a variety of experts, not fully in the mainstream, but who clearly know the science, how severe is it? Does it necessarily have to involve these dire, earth-destroying conclusions and consequences? No, but we don't know because there is not an open, free competition of ideas, because the game is rigged partly. And how is the game rigged? Because the government supplies the money to fund, subsidize, and direct research in ways that reinforce those views and do not challenge them. Now, I want to say, maybe this is the problem, but that would be a separate issue, because then there would be still the issue, what is the best response? Government heavy-handed central planning like is being proposed through all these global agreements, the Paris Accords and others, or decentralized market responses that use prices, profits, and opportunities discovered through competition to find ways to adapt and adjust and modify in the changing circumstances of local areas around the globe, because everywhere is not the same, nor is it affected by the climate all the same. But is that the method? Trusting minds that are free through competitive markets? No, it's a judgment as to what the problem is and a presumption of what the solution has to be. And that, in my humble opinion, has been heavily influenced by the fact of who pays for the funding, and therefore creates the incentives and the motives to follow a particular path of analysis and conclusion.
Okay, well, that principle of funding of organization brings us to another subject, and it's near and dear to your heart, and that's something that Jonathan Turley talked about last night at the university level, of the massive suppression of speech that's taking place there, the cancel culture, the politically correct thinking, the preventing people from speaking, especially right-wingers from speaking. I mean, it's where the left has really shined negatively in terms of trying to shut down discourse. But Richard, as libertarians, we would argue that private institutions would be free to establish any rules they want. Private university doesn't want left speaker or right wing speaker, they would certainly have the right to implement that rule. And if students didn't like that rule, they could go elsewhere. The problem is what you're raising in terms of this government largesse, is that the government is funding these universities. And to what extent is that contributing to the problem? Well, I have no question that it's contributing to the problem, because in a market, when the university goes off in a weird direction, people can just stop donating. They can stop sending their students there. But when you have this independent funding largesse from the government, you don't have to respond to those market forces. All you have to do is cater to the government to fund your operations in a bigger way to make up for any shortfalls. And so my feeling is that why don't we just stop all funding of universities, stop the largesse, and then let the universities make whatever policy they have and let the free market ferret it all out. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think that we have created a system in which you have these institutions of higher learning that either completely or heavily are islands of socialism. Now, I just don't mean the views of people in a number of disciplines on campus. I mean institutionally, because they are many colleges and universities are owned by the state. Now, California State University, right? SUNY New York, These are all state-owned and funded institutions of higher learning. Do they get donations from benefactors? Do parents pay all or partial tuitions? Of course they do. But a huge amount of their funding is dependent upon the state in which they are operating in and federal subsidies, grants, and other forms of student loan supports, all of which means that they are not responsive to the market. And by the market, in this sense, I mean, what is it that parents and the students themselves would like to acquire as an education in higher learning? The type of courses, the type of fields, the type of curriculum, the type of variety of points of views. I personally doubt that there would be this degree of capture by the left over a variety of departments, often history, sociology, English, political science, degrees of economics, but economics has tended to resist that more than other social sciences, and now creeping into the hard sciences. I doubt that this would have occurred or would remain this the case if parents would see, is this what my kid's education is? Is this the content? Is this offering my son and daughter an avenue to follow a reasonable and successful career when they leave the institution of higher learning? Do the students want to be taking these classes? And is this where they want to go? And directing either their own money or their parents' money in these directions when they apply to an institution. If they were more directly, immediately, and completely responsive to the market signals of what the consumers want, I would suggest that not only would there be less of this nonsense being taught, but there'd be fewer such people hired and employed in these colleges and universities. That they are sheltered by government funding and government guaranteed employments in their little ideological and institutional islands of socialism.
Okay, well, on that note, we're out of time, but let me emphasize that if you want to pierce more deeply into this area of economic liberties and civil liberties, Richard's talk is online on at our website, fff.org, in the multimedia section. I don't think I've ever heard a better talk that incorporates civil liberties and economic liberties than Richard's talk, and I highly recommend you take the time to do so. In fact, if you haven't been participating in our Civil Liberties Conference, I can't recommend it more highly. I mean, I know I'm biased, but this is one of the best conferences we've ever put on. I think it's the best conference on civil liberties that has ever been put on by any libertarian group. What's fascinating is that I didn't put any restrictions or recommendations on any of the speakers on what aspect of civil liberties to talk about. And so far, we've had 7 speakers, and there's been almost no duplication at all. They've all hit different angles. And to the extent there is duplication, it's because they've emphasized things that everybody feels are important and need to be re-emphasized and re-emphasized. So I highly recommend you take the time to watch this. Civil liberties are a critical, necessary prerequisite to a free society. Next week, we have the great Judge Andrew Napolitano. I know everyone knows Judge Napolitano, and you're in store for another fantastic talk. That will be followed by the great Ron Paul, and then I'll wrap things up with a talk at the end. So we look forward to seeing you next week. All you got to do is go to the to the webpage for our Civil Liberties Conference, which is on our homepage, and register, and you'll get a Zoom link, and then you can log in next Tuesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Richard, I greatly enjoyed this conversation, and I want to thank all our viewers for tuning in.
Until next time.